thank our host and sponsor, which is RenaFi. Thank you, RenaFi. RenaFi provides research-based practical education. At RenaFi, we teach about the underlying drivers of our behavior, and that knowledge leads to better decisions, and better decisions lead to an improved quality of life. Visit renafi.com. Without further ado, let me introduce my guest. Hey, my guest. So this is Jay Reid. She spoke at the 2021 International ADHD Conference on the intersection of ADHD and ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale. So we came here to talk about trauma.
Okay.
So trauma, traumatic, we use that in conversation. What does it, what's the meaning of the word?
You know, there's a push and pull around the language with trauma. I want people to be aware of how common trauma is, but sometimes the way we use the words, we minimize what it is and the effects of it and what people who've been traumatized go through, right? So you'll see someone, you know, maybe watch a performance on television that they really didn't like and they go, oh, I'm triggered, right? And that has a very definite definition. And it's a really meaningful word for folks who are living with trauma and who are still healing from trauma. Trauma has a very specific definition as well. So clinically, trauma has a pretty, depending on where you're looking, right? So the word trauma, when you're talking about a clinical diagnosis, you're looking in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic Bible that psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, and therapists use to make a diagnosis. The diagnostic criteria there is more narrow. It talks about near death or serious injury to you or someone that you love or you very close to, or being a person who often sees death or serious injury like a first responder, right? That's part of the diagnostic criteria. For diagnosing, say, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or acute traumatic stress disorder. There's plenty more research around what trauma is. So if you look at the SAMHSA definition, what you'll see is a definition that talks more about the experience, the event, how the person experienced it, and then the effects. So the SAMHSA definition talks more about an event, a set of events, even a set of circumstances that have happened to a person that can then cause either some short-term changes or some long-term changes to that person's functioning. One of the better definitions that I use comes from the Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is really an set of events or circumstances that completely overwhelm a person's internal resources or ability to process it. Okay, so what you're looking at, again, takes you back to there is an event or events or a set of circumstances, right? Then depending on the individual experience of those events or circumstances, right? That the event is the trauma, then that person may experience that as a complete overwhelm of their internal ability to process, integrate, understand that experience. Okay, when that happens, typically you're going to have either some temporary symptoms or what we call a trauma response. And then some people go on to develop a chronic trauma response. Only about 20% of people who experience a trauma will go on to develop a chronic trauma response. But there's certain things about certain individuals that increase that risk. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. I don't want to jump the gun.
I appreciate that because it's helpful for us to hear it is a technical term. And so
Right.
when we're talking to people for whom it has the technical meaning, what do they think it means, right?
Right.
So we do have a question in the Q&A, and I think I'm just going to read it out. Let's see what how it lands with you. What are the subtle differences in healing from an external trauma versus a self-imposed trauma? And I'm wondering, is there, hey, my internal conversation is traumatizing me, is abusing me in some way. Is that a thing?
When you say, well, I'm looking at the question. When you say self-imposed trauma, are we talking substance abuse, some trauma from something that you did or imposed upon yourself? Is that the question? I just want to be clear before I start answering.
I agree that I'm not clear, so I'm going to wait.
Okay.
ADHD failures, that's the answer. Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you for giving us more to work
Gotcha.
with. Yeah.
What's interesting and what I found in my work is most of the time, people who are suffering from trauma and a chronic trauma response or unprocessed trauma aren't all that great at defining where the trauma came from or assigning responsibility or blame. Is they take both the responsibility for the wound and the responsibility for the healing. And sometimes that's too much of a burden. I will be honest with you, regardless of who did it, self-imposed or imposed upon you, the healing process is very much the same, because trauma survivors tend to have a significant amount of guilt and shame, no matter who did what to whom. Yeah. So if it's, I lost my house, my kids, my wife from my drinking, we start digging, we recognize your drinking was a coping mechanism for all of these other things, right? So you may be responsible for the drinking, but what about what you were coping for? And then you'll start uncovering what you were coping for, and they're guilty. They feel guilty for the coping mechanism and the thing that caused them to need to cope.
I feel like when we're looking around the ADHD, there's so much of external messages to us about that we're cause in the matter, right? Even the way this question came to us, that we caused this, mostly because people don't understand the ADHD. Maybe we don't even understand the ADHD. And so we take ownership of, oh, I guess I am lazy. Instead of, hey, I was looking out the window at school and my mind was wandering and it was interesting to me, versus, oh, this is a brain condition.
Gotcha.
I have it. I didn't invent it. I didn't make it be that way.
This is one of the things that I call to be shame detectives. And because finding shame a lot of times is where we're going to start looking at your coping mechanisms. And finding shame is also we're gonna find some big red stop signs, things that stop you, because shame is a big red stop sign. So what you'll find is shame is not something any of us are born with. It's always acquired. So when you say ADHD failures, what I'm hearing is shame, from my understanding of my actions that may have been caused by ADHD, lack of diagnosis and the lack of support around that, right? Okay, the should underneath that shame, where did it come from? You weren't born with it. Somebody gave you a message that I should be able to get up on Saturday morning and clean my room, the whole thing, without getting distracted, stuck in my closet, right? Finding a game under the bed and losing 3 hours from it. That should, again, you weren't born with it. That's the message that was generated outside of you, external to you, and then you accept it. So internal or self-imposed trauma, I still look at it as, where did the message come from? And then that message typically that we've accepted that should, we had to make sense of our lives some kind of way until we came to better understanding and better information. So it goes back to coping, same thing.